This month we start a new part of our theme for the year when we started talking about thinking on these things, and it is the idea of thinking on things which are noble. And so the three words that I want us to use this morning, and these are words that you're going to hear repeatedly this month as we talk about what it means to be noble and what it means to think on things which are noble. The words are dignity, honor, and respect. Dignity, honor, and respect. There is a huge amount of casualness in our society. You don't have to go very far into the world to see how casual people have become in their conversations with one another, in their dealings with one another, in the way in which we dress and appear with one another, the way in which we come into God's presence to offer our worship. You see a lot of casualness in our society. That is not necessarily a good thing, because we as Christians are called upon to be noble-minded people. We are called upon to have some dignity and some honor and respect. So I want us to go to Philippians 4 and verse 8, because that's our passage that we're using this year as our theme passage. And remember that as you're turning there, that a couple of months ago as we started this, we talked about thinking upon or meditating upon things which are. That word meditating, we notice, is a word that means to ponder, to think upon deeply, to muse over. We notice that many of the times that the word is used in connection with things even like singing, that the things that we sing about and we should be singing, as Jim said this morning, as he was thinking about songs last week and throughout this week, getting ready for the song service this morning, it brought to mind various things because that's a form of meditation. But one of the also ways in which that word meditation is used, and the way that it's used in Psalm chapter 1 about the person who meditates upon the law of God, means to rip into, to purr over, or to growl over. It means to tear something apart deeply and to devour it and to bring it to become part of your very being. And so as we begin to meditate upon those things which are first and foremost, as we looked at last month, things which are true, which they are in accordance with what the actual reality is about. This month we're looking at this idea of things which are noble. Some of your versions may use the word honorable or the word honest. There is a very strong connection between the words true and honest in the English language. But in the Greek language, there's a good bit of a difference that's there. It's not that the word is mistranslated. However, it carries more of an idea than just not lying or telling the truth. It has something to do with this idea that we're going to be looking at of dignity and honor and respect, and getting rid of a lot of the casualness that we have in our services oftentimes and in our lives. So let's first and foremost, as we talk about being noble-minded, define what do we mean by the word noble. When you hear the word noble, what is it that immediately comes to mind? It's the reason I used a crown as the image for this month, because it does have the idea of nobility attached to it. The Greek word that is used there in Philippians 4 and verse 8 is simnos, which means those things which are august or dignified, has gravitas attached to it. It's weighty, it's deeply respected because it's viewed as being majestic. It has gravity, it's very, very grave in nature. What's also interesting about this word is it's the word that's not used very many times in the Scriptures, but it is part of a family of words that are used a few more times in Scriptures to describe some things that we may not always think about. For example, in Matthew 15 and verse 9, where Jesus is criticizing the Pharisees for the way in which they were forcing their traditions upon the people as being the religious doctrine of the time, Jesus says, "In vain they worship me, teaching as doctrine the commandments of men." The word worship in that verse is the word that we're talking about, and part of that family of words we're talking about. And so when we're talking about something being noble, it is the idea of that kind of nobility that's attached to worship. It's reverence. It is something where we hold in absolute awe the thing in which we are in worship of. And so when Jesus says, "In vain you worship me, in vain you honor me, in vain you're showing nobility. Your nobility is false." And so when we think about what this is like, think of it this way. A king walks around in his palace wearing his crown. And as he is walking around in his palace with his crown upon his head, dressed in his kingly robes, you would expect him to act and behave himself in a certain manner and in a certain way. But even when he takes those robes off and he lays his crown to the side and he is outside of his castle, you still expect that king to act in a certain way. It's not just as he has that robe and that crown upon his head that he is supposed to have some nobility about him. He is expected and held to a higher standard than others because of who he is, not because of what he's wearing. And so we as Christians are not people who are Christians just because we come to services or we're wearing the name Christian, or whenever we're in the services, we're to be acting as noble people. It is all the time, not because of what we do, but because of who we are. That's what it means to have nobility as being a part of our character, not just a part of our actions. And so what we're talking about with nobility when it comes to this idea of worship then, and the way it's tied into that would be this. If you are a priest and you're in the temple performing your priestly duties, how would you expect that priest to act? And so each and every day of our life, we're supposed to be seeing ourselves as walking through the temple grounds, doing our priestly duties at every moment of every day, because that's who we are, as we're going to see. That's why this word is used when it talks about some of the older men and some of those who are in positions of leadership. I want us to look at some verses in 1 Timothy where this word and the family of word is used. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Therefore I exhort first of all that all supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings and all who are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence. It is used there in that verse, that word reverence is used there. Also later in this same letter in chapter 3 and verse 4, in talking about the elders, it says, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. One of the things that we need to understand about this idea of reverence means that when we have reverence, our household is also going to have it. And that this casualness that you see in other homes and in society is not to be in the home of that person who is the elder. He's not one who is in that position of leadership. His family is to be held in reverence and maintaining standards of reverence and respect as well, that worshipful, noble attitude. In verse 8, the deacons are said that they must be reverent. Also in verse 11, the wives must also be reverent. It's used many times over and over again to talk about the way in which they're supposed to behave themselves. Maybe the best way to understand what the word reverence means is to understand what it does not mean. So look back at 1 Timothy 3 and notice that this bishop, who's supposed to be blameless, first and foremost on the list there. But in verse 4, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence or gravity. If a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? A person who is of nobility, a person who is to be held in reverence, is not to be a novice. He's not to be somebody who's easily puffed up with pride, lest he fall into the same snare of the devil. He has to have a good testimony, not a bad testimony among those who are outside. Of the deacons, he has to be reverent. In other words, he's not supposed to be double-tongued. He's not supposed to be someone who's given to much wine or gluttonous or greedy. You could look at as being not greedy for money. He's somebody who's supposed to be able to hold the mystery of the faith with a pure conscience. And so over and over again, this idea of reverence is not one where a person just is given that because of an office that he has, but because of the kind of life that he leads. And so when Paul tells us that we are supposed to be meditating upon or thinking about those things, mulling over and delving into those things that are noble, we're supposed to be taking this as part of our character, that in the midst of whatever struggles are going on, whatever society is throwing at me, I must realize I am a king and a priest in the midst of this, and that I am not subject to the same types of rules and regulations that others are, that I am indeed, because of who I am, supposed to be above this, not as someone who is subjected to it, but as someone who is ruling over it. Someone who is a king and able to exercise nobility in the midst of it, but also as a priest to be able to teach others how they're supposed to act in the midst of it. That's what nobility is. That's what honorability is. That's what reverence is all about. But if we have a casual, lackadaisical attitude in our lives, it's very easy for Satan to take advantage of us. You've seen all the wildlife films. That the gazelle that's out there on the outside that's just bouncing around, not paying attention, that's the one that's easily taken because he's very casual in his attitude. As Christians, that's not who we are. We're supposed to be noble-minded people. It's used also in Titus chapter 2. Titus chapter 2. This is the kind of character that is described as being and should be present in older men, that the older men be sober, reverent, it is said there, temperate, sound in faith, in love, and in patience. Also, in verse 7, Paul, in including Titus among those of the young men, says, in all things showing yourself to be a pattern of good works, in doctrine showing integrity, reverence, incorruptibility. And so it is not something that is only limited to age. It should be something naturally that you see in age, that people grow more dignified, not less. Our society seems to revel in the idea of showing older people in these very vulgar ways and getting the rest of us to laugh about those things as if it's a good thing, a cute thing. It is not, because older people should have some reverence about them. But also the younger people. If an elder is raising his family in such a way that they are held to a standard of reverence, gravity, dignity, respect, honor, being noble, then we should see it among our young people. That is a sure sign of what's going on within a home, when you see casualness when it comes to the way in which we conduct ourselves. Nobility is something that as Christians we're supposed to have. And so the way I want to go about looking at this morning as we begin this study is to look at it from that idea and to reinforce something that you've heard many times, and that is we are expected to be looked at as being kings and priests. There's never been a time where God has not had those that are worshiping Him. And throughout history, you see time and again God using the idea of a priest and offering that worship to God. Instead of just the idea of just anyone worshiping, but the idea of a priest. That even in the New Testament we have our high priest being Jesus Christ. In the Old Testament, even as far back as Melchizedek, you have one of this mysterious origin who was a priest of God Most High. And God has always used these people to be looked upon as being set apart and separated from the people, as being able to approach Him and be accepted by Him. And I think that's a very strong image that we should have. Back in 1 Peter chapter 1, we're going to be looking at primarily 1 Peter this morning, chapter 2. But I want you to look back at 1 Peter chapter 1 and notice verse 16. When Peter tells the brethren to gird up the loins of their mind, to no longer be ignorant, but be obedient children, he puts this in the midst of it, and this being the reason why. Be holy, for I am holy. And in verse 18, he says that you might be delivered from your aimless conduct. And in verse 22, you've purified your souls in obeying the truth. And so Peter, as he's writing to these Jews who are scattered abroad, he reminds them of something that's very important that he said in the reading that was read for us just prior to the reading that was read for us a few moments ago, that you are a chosen generation. You're chosen by your God, who is a holy God. And over again, when God would tell them that you belong to me and you are my holy people, He would always say, I am the Lord your God. There's something about the commandments that God gave that were not just about instructing the people on how to act, but it had something to do with who God Himself was. And so when God is telling us to be holy as I am holy, it's not because you have to keep instructions that are holy. You are to be holy as I am holy. He doesn't say, I give you these instructions so that you might learn what holiness is about. He says, I'm giving you these instructions because I am holy. You be holy. Peter translates that in that next chapter, in chapter 2, and starting at verse 9, when he says, but you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, His own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of Him who called you out of darkness and into His marvelous light, who were once not a people, but are now the people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. Back in Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6, as the people are gathering around the mountain in order to receive the commandments from God, And you remember that as they're going to be receiving these things, they're supposed to consecrate themselves. They're supposed to be ready for this day that's going to come. And they're supposed to set themselves apart, ready for this day. And in verses 5 and 6 it says, "Now therefore, if you'll indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel." And so in chapter 20, when he gives those, again he says, "I am the Lord your God." So what does it mean then to be noble-minded? Think upon these things. Paul says, whatever things are noble, think upon those things. You have these two sisters who are at odds with one another. What are they supposed to do? Remember, your citizenship is in heaven. And think upon those things that are kingly. Think about those things that are priestly in nature. Think about those things that are above the pettiness that may be going on. If you're in the midst of worry, think about those things which are noble. You're a king. You're a priest. God takes care of his kings. He takes care of his priests. You have the commandments of the Lord. And you are a godly person because of God's holiness. And you are also holy because of that. You're a priest. Think about those things that are noble, not those things that are petty, not those things which are mundane, not the things which the world around you is worrying about, because you are of nobility and you are a priest. So God says that we can be this chosen generation. He also says that we are a royal priesthood. Jesus is indeed that king that's been set apart, that we owe all of our allegiance to. And Jesus has been set aside as being the ultimate standard of what a king's supposed to be. Earlier in this same chapter of 2 Peter, or 1 Peter rather, chapter 2, in verse 5, he had already said earlier, "You also as living stones are being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ." And so just as it was in the Old Testament when the priest would offer his sacrifices, that he may have to burn incense to God, we say our prayers and it rises up as a sweet-smelling aroma. They had all these physical utensils that they would use. You and I use our heart and our spirit in order to worship our God and to offer to him those sacrifices. But we are a priesthood. Something interesting about that priesthood, if you go to Hebrews chapter 10, 11 and 12. This verse has always stood out to me when I think about what it means for us to be priests. Hebrews 10, 11 and 12. "And every priest stands ministering daily and offering repeatedly the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But this man, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down at the right hand of God." Notice two different things that or positions that are talked about. The priest stands, but Jesus Christ as a high priest sits. Jesus Christ has accomplished what it is that he's supposed to do. But we are still priests. We're not offering the same sacrifices that they did, but we're still priests. And those priests offer those sacrifices daily. It wasn't upon the first day of the week only. It was daily. And we as priests are not offering our sacrifices to God one day a week only, or only on the first day of the week. We offer our sacrifices on a daily basis. We are noble people. We are kings and we are priests. We are a nation of priests and kings. And that's why God has set us apart, that we may do that very thing. He calls us a holy nation. Israel was a nation that was supposed to be distinguishable from the other nations around them. They had different laws, different commandments, and different standards that they lived by. However, they violated that so often and looked just like the world around them. When we talk about casualness, and the reason why casualness is such a dangerous thing is because it makes us look like everyone else. It makes us look like the commandments we have really don't matter. You go to church every week. You go to Bible study every week. You say all these prayers and everything. How has it made you look different than anyone else around you? That's a chastisement from the world, but it's also one, if we're honest, many times we would have to chastise ourselves about that. Do I really look like a king in the midst of them? Do I really look like a priest in the midst of them? Am I distinguishable? In Isaiah 62, verses 11 and 12, this is a prophecy that's given. "Indeed, the Lord has proclaimed to the end of the world, say to the daughter of Zion, surely your salvation is coming. Behold, his reward is with him, and his work before him. And they shall call them the holy people, the redeemed of the Lord, and you shall be called sought out, a city not forsaken. I love that phrase. You shall be called the sought out. You are the ones that God has chosen. You are the ones that God has laid a path for. You are the ones that God has separated from the world. You are the ones that God has said, you belong to me, and you are a nation of kings and priests, and you are a holy nation. And this is the thing that was prophesied about, that others are supposed to see you, others are supposed to see us and say, those are the ones that God sought out to be his very own people. They are distinguishable. They are different. They are noticeably different from everyone else around them. They are not held under the same mundane principles and all the things that tear the rest of society down, because we walk among it as kings and we are noble in the midst of it. We don't resort to the tactics that others do because we have wise counsel like a king would. We know that we have an army behind us because we are kings. We know we have the commandments of God and the force of God's very own power and will behind us because we are priests and we uphold his standards. That's what nobility is about. Whenever you are distraught, whatever it is that brings you down, meditate upon those things which are noble, those things which are honorable, those things which are dignified, respectful, and have reverence attached to them, because once again, we are his own special people. Some of my favorite passages that I've grown to love, especially over the past few years, is this idea when God says that you belong to me. Isaiah 43 and verse 1 is one example. Isaiah 43 and verse 1. But now, thus says the Lord who created you, O Jacob, and he who formed you, O Israel. Fear not, for I have redeemed you, and I have called you by your name. You are mine. I love those passages because it speaks to us so very bluntly on who it is we belong to. You know, in Paul talks to the Corinthians and says, your body is not your own, you were bought at a price. And we read that often, and I think we use it almost as a whipping verse to say that don't do those things because you belong to God. And Paul is actually using it in such a fashion as that. But there's so much beauty to the idea as well. You belong to God. You're his special people. He chose you. You heard what it was that God was offering to all of mankind, and you knew the price that you were going to have to pay in order to have those things which God had promised. And you were willing to pay that price. And God says that makes you very, very special in my sight. And you belong to me. And because you belong to me, you don't have to worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will worry about itself. Sufficient is today for its own trouble. You can cast all your care upon him, Peter says in 1 Peter 5:7, because he cares about you. You belong to him. Meditate upon those things which are noble. To meditate upon those things which are noble, which is to meditate upon that fact. I belong to the Lord. No one else. I belong to him. He chose me. And I love him because of that. Because of the great love for which he loved me. We know the price that he paid to purchase us. And that's why we rejoice in the fact that we are a saved people. There's some haunting passages in Hosea. Hosea 1, as we have this prophet who is to take a wife of harlotry. And he's to do that to demonstrate how it is that Israel had forsaken the Lord their God. And there's two children that I want us to pay particular attention to that are mentioned in the first chapter. Hosea chapter 1 and verse 6. And she conceived again and bore a daughter. Then God said to him, call her name Lo-Rahumah, for I will no longer have mercy on the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them away. So this child's name means no mercy. In verse 9, then God said about this other child that is born, call his name Lo-Ami, for you are not my people. Literally it means not mine. If you go back to 1 Peter chapter 2, when Peter reminds them that they are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light. He reminds them of something, that this is not, I don't believe, referring to the Gentiles specifically, but as Peter is writing to Jewish people who are scattered abroad because of the persecution that's coming upon them, Peter reminds them that you were a people not just who were outside, like Paul is talking about in the Ephesian letter, but you were outside because of your transgression and your leaving. That God said, I'm not going to have mercy on you. God says, you are not mine because of that. And it's to those people that Peter writes these things when he says, who were once not a people, who had not obtained mercy. And to these people, he says, you are now the people of God, and you have obtained mercy. The reason that we think about things which are noble is because we know what it was like for God to look at us and say, no mercy. To wear it so strongly that it becomes actually our name. No mercy. Not mine. And we see it amongst our brethren from time to time, that you look upon them and God says, not mine. But to know that we can be accepted, and we can even be accepted back, that we were all a people who have not obtained mercy, but now we have. And for a very specific reason, that you may proclaim the praises. Brethren, there's no one else on the face of the planet who has the right to proclaim the praises of God other than you, because you belong to him. So when you get caught up and trapped by all those things that are going on in life, meditate upon that. You're not to spend your time worrying, complaining, murmuring, disputing, cursing, because you belong to him. Your time is to be spent in noble pursuits, priestly things in your life. Those are the things that you're supposed to be concentrating upon. Meditate upon that. What is the good thing that you can do? What is the noble thing that you can do? What is the reverent and respectful thing that you can do? That's what we meditate upon when we're noble-minded. And as Peter concludes this section, he says that we are indeed an honorable people. So he says, I beg you, as sojourners and pilgrims in verse 11, to abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, and have your conduct honorable. Let it be noble. Let it be kingly, priestly among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. That's what we've been delivered for. And so this month, as we go into this study of the idea of being noble, let it be something that fills your prayers. Let it be something that you look up the word in the scriptures and see the different times which honor and nobility, respect, reverence are used. And let it be something that we meditate upon this month. I hope this has been an encouragement to you. My question for you is, are you living a noble life? That is our purpose this month, is to think about those things. If you need to begin that by being part of the family of God, as we said, one of the most precious things that God ever says to anyone is, you belong to me. And this morning, if you will accept the Lord's grace and mercy, be baptized for the remission of your sins, or to repent of sins, to come back to him, God is merciful. And he will once again say, you are mine, you belong to me. If we can help you in any way whatsoever, won't you please come as together we stand and sing.